Welcome back, legal enthusiasts, to yet another episode of Off the Desk at the Law Culture. We have with us Mr. Harry Clark, who is a podcaster, a law blogger, and now a trainee solicitor at Baker McKenzie, London.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you with us, sir. So we will begin. I was particularly intrigued to have this session with you because I tried my hand at blogging a few years back and I realized it's not a piece of cake. It's not just something you can do. It's difficult. So I would like our viewers to understand what motivated and inspired you to start your own blog and start your podcast.
Yeah, of course. So I went through the application process like a lot of students are currently doing now, and obviously currently practicing solicitors have. And all throughout my time at university, I had everything from law fairs on my campus with lawyers and the law firms themselves coming and giving presentations to us, as well as kind of an on-campus guidance counselor with regards to careers specifically into law. And it was through my experiences of speaking to students through social media and connecting with them on LinkedIn and starting to sort of produce this blog that I realized that access and information to all this kind of stuff can be a bit of a postcode lottery at times. And also there's a great deal of information, which is something which you will find out in the future of your career, which could also quite easily be communicated kind of earlier down the line in terms of your development and your education and so on. So the kind of main ethos and thrust behind everything I was doing was to try to sort of pass on the information I've learned from others through the podcast, as you say, through speaking to them, to recruiters and CEOs and people who are traditionally less sort of accessible, as well as based on my own experiences and many mistakes that I made throughout the whole process, and trying to essentially save others time and to also give them more of an insight into everything the legal world has to offer. Because I think before I got started with this, I had a very narrow view as to what the word law meant and just quite how many facets and roles and practice areas there were, even just within the commercial sector, let alone outside of it. And my kind of goal and journey now is to not only to try to help others learn more about law, but also I'm learning about it as well in the conversations I'm having with both practicing and aspiring lawyers alike.
All right.
So, what do you actually understand, or could you just give a brief about what is commercial awareness and why is it so important in nowadays?
Yeah, of course. So I think this is a bit of a buzzword that a lot of students or aspiring lawyers will probably hear about or read about in their sort of applications and starting to develop a skill. And I think it's really critical to being a lawyer, and based on my conversations with other practicing lawyers and those who were sort of more influential in the decision-making process, it is as well. The Association of Graduate Recruiters said this is one of the most pressing skills that they're looking for in their candidates in sort of recent times. 71% of sort of senior decision makers and recruiters said that they take a 2-1 candidate with commercial acumen, commercial awareness and business sort of acumen experience over a comparable first candidate who didn't. And so I think this is a really kind of important and key skill, which isn't always being communicated in the most effective way at university or even during law school. So in terms of how you define it, I think a really basic way to try and phrase this is just to think of it as context and trying to understand the what's going on behind just the black letter law. So lawyers are there to obviously do their legal research and the black letter law stuff and the back of room things in terms of figuring out what the law is. But it's not enough to simply just go to a client and say, yes, section 40 of the Companies Act says X, because one, that's not how they want to be presented their information. They want solutions and they want advice, and for you to give them the answers and options on the table for them to make a decision. But secondly as well, that doesn't account for any of the other sort of characteristics that a given client might have. So, a client might approach you and say, I need this deal done in 2 weeks' time, or I'm operating in this given industry, or I'm looking to expand in these areas or this geographical location, or I've got this sort of budget. All of these are sort of extenuating factors which will change how a client will apportion their risk and kind of change their decision-making process. And a big part of that is having a good understanding of the sort of external business world, or this external commercial awareness, all these stories which are going on in the world. How is that going to impact clients' decision-making? How is it going to impact your clients' customers in terms of their spending habits and what they're doing, and supply chains and how your client is being able to produce their product and services. And you as a lawyer are going to help them kind of navigate those business decisions and those business goals, not only through your legal advice, but through that sort of commercial business advice as well. So that external awareness of what's going on around you is really important. But then secondly, I think this is an aspect that is really underemphasized, is also the internal side of commercial awareness and understanding how firms themselves work as businesses. So like any other business, a firm has to make money, it has to make profit, has to keep their clients happy, and it has to try and be innovative in order to stay ahead of their competitors. And you as a trainee or a graduate in a new role will be a big part of this huge machine and a small cog to play, and a really important one in terms of your ability to coordinate and help all these other pieces of the law firm provide their services and all fit together. So the way I look at it, I think there's two sides to commercial awareness: that external side of the general business world, new stories which are going on and new developments, but also within your given firm, within your given industry, and how you as an individual on a more sort of micro level are going to be adding value to what your law firm does as a business, and ultimately how they're going to try and reign and stay profitable as well. So to summarize that, I think there's a really kind of really good example of what is called the sort of two-stage commerciality test, which means whenever a lawyer is going to give information, obviously the first stage is, what are the legal options available here? What does the black letter law say in terms of what we can do and how we can proceed, or what our rights and obligations might be in this given scenario? But the second is, accounting for all of that stuff I just mentioned, all of their context, all of the other factors going on around the world, in the world around us. They're given characteristics and factors at play, which of these options might be most appropriate, and which one garners the sort of appropriate level of risk reward in terms of what the client is looking for and how they're looking to achieve their business objective. So first stage, legally, is it possible? And then secondly, commercial, which one of these is probably most favorable?
Fair enough. So we've seen COVID-19 changing quite a lot of things. It has changed not just the way we live our lives, like wearing mask is a norm now. Sanitizing is a norm now. So it has also affected commercial transactions, commercial outlaws. So how do you think this pandemic has changed the commercial being and commercial outlaws?
Yeah, so the first thing to mention is you're absolutely right. It's changed the way we work. And I think previously this whole conversation about remote working and whether this is going to be some kind of pipe dream or a bit of a gimmick in terms of law firms being able to go fully virtual and drive around with RVs for offices, which I've seen a few companies do in America before this pandemic, which is really interesting. And obviously, as a matter of necessity, that conversation has shifted from, this might be a nice thing to try and experiment with on a kind of given basis, to this is a necessity and this is a reality we have to contend with. And whilst I'd certainly caveat that these aren't usual working from home conditions, given the fact it's sort of coping from home during a pandemic and having to juggle everything else that's going on where you're living. I'm hoping that lawyers and every other business alike will have had at least a flavour of what remote working is like, and the benefits and the drawbacks that come with it, in the same way that they would come with having to commute and go into an office and working from an office in that sense. I'm sure there'll be many people who leave this pandemic thinking, I never want to do remote working again, because it's obviously been associated with all the stresses and anxieties of remote working with everything else going on at home. But from what I can tell from talking to practicing lawyers as well, a good majority are really happy with what they're currently doing and want to see the office as a possible extension of their home workplace and something that they would travel into on a limited basis. So I certainly think remote working is one of the really key facets of how it's impacted not just law, but everything else with COVID. I think that's really clear and demonstrable. The second being is that I think, unlike some other industries, law has a number of services, a number of locations, a number of sort of ways of doing things which were previously inherently tied to physical locations, physical documents, and wet ink and kind of having to go there in person. So obviously courts are a really huge example of that. Traditionally, the signing of documents and having to do everything on wet ink, or conveyancing, exchanging of real estate. These are all examples of where again, you could talk for a lot about what they've given reasons as to why we're doing it that way traditionally, but at least that's the way things were in terms of how we kind of sign documents and move forward. And obviously, again, with tying in with remote work, there's had to be at least a short-term shift in terms of trying to put things on pause and wait for we can go back to some form of doing it in person, or instead an adaptability to change and sign documents electronically and so on. And I think whilst there's certainly been a short-term uptick in people doing that, it's also quite clear, I think some people culturally have just always preferred doing things, quote unquote, the old-fashioned way. I know that HMRC, for example, with some of their documents, they're now requesting that everything be done through paper and by post, rather than by trying to embrace this new wave of technology. So that's a really clear example of how, innovation within the legal industry is not always just a question of technologically can we do X, but culturally is this going to be picked up and done by everyone else, and what's the kind of shift required from a user level in terms of how they're going to have to change their current working habits. And if one party like HMRC or the government or the whole judicial system says they want to do this in X amount of way, then obviously all the lawyers and all the law firms and everyone else kind of has to respond to it just because they're the one who's made that decision. So certainly how documents and everything else being executed are changing as well. So yeah, I think if anything, those are really two key areas where the kind of law industry is really having to change as a result of COVID-19 in the sense of working remotely and also having to act remotely with regards to what they're doing and transitioning to the sort of e-signing of documents and kind of electronic copies and so on. And then finally, I think it's important to understand a little bit in terms of the world of law, let alone commercial law, is incredibly broad, and COVID-19 is not going to be a equal kind of leveler in terms of how it's going to affect given practice areas, given industries, and given types of law firms. So obviously, it's really common sense that smaller law firms and those who are more medium-sized have less budget and less ability to absorb financial shocks like these because they're smaller and they just don't have the revenue of these incredible multinational, multi-billion firms who rely on that sort of revenue and so on. And so the size of the law firm and how they're currently practicing, their overheads, and the fact that client invoices might be paid a little less on time and frequently with regards to how they were pre-pandemic is a really big factor. But then secondly as well, it's practice area. So, law is an industry which is sort of semi-recession proof because when deals fall through, when contracts get broken, when events like these happen, force majeure clauses obviously spring to mind, people get unhappy, disputes happen, and this is obviously where litigious lawyers can step in and try and fix things. And then on the flip side, when business is good, when people are looking to expand, buy new businesses, acquire new companies, invest in new practices, transactional work will pick up because that's what the lawyers do with that regard. So, I think across the board, the kind of areas of emphasis and focus, at least in the short term, due to COVID-19 within practice areas and how they're sort of being divvied out, will certainly shift. I think the question remains to be seen longer term. If we're arguably in this position in, say, a year's time, let's hope not. If companies will decide to, still pursue with acquisitions that they might have considered previously on the basis that they understand this is going to be at least a quote unquote new reality for a little bit longer, and this is what they're going to have to be dealing with. So, yeah, I think those are sort of three areas that I think, at least specifically with law, those are really sort of key areas of potential transition, at least in the short term.
Shifting a little focus to the economic front, we've seen the world economy shift down to a recession, and a lot of people have come down and said it might be even worse than the 1932 depression. So the countries are struggling to manage their economies vis-a-vis dealing with the pandemic also. So India has taken out a relief package to help the suffering sectors, a 20 lakh crore package to help the sectors which are suffering. What measures has your country taken to deal with the situation on the economic front?
Yeah, so I think obviously the health situation and everything that's associated with COVID-19 is obviously real concern, and this is the main emphasis and focusing point. But the economic conversation is also there, and I think it's I guess I don't know if intriguing is the right word, but essentially this is unlike a lot of other kind of recessions and crashes we've seen, because the initial cause of everything wasn't some huge loan default or mortgage situation like we had in 2008, for example. Instead, it's the economy essentially got put on pause. Consumers were told to stop walking through their high street, to sit in their homes, and as a result of that, there was obviously a huge shift in consumer behavior with loads of people jumping on Disney Plus and Zoom and all these digital equivalents of how they're going to interact and enjoy their things at home. And everything else on the high street and restaurants and businesses and everything were obviously kind of just left in the dark and on pause for a given time. And in response to that, the government's kind of implemented a number of different schemes here in the UK. They have most recently the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, so trying to support hospitality businesses and restaurants by encouraging people to go out and eat out for discounted meals. Obviously, the main one of the talking point was the whole furlough scheme, the idea that companies could furlough their workers and the government would subsidize their wages in order to try to stop companies following through with kind of mass unemployment and firing in order to try to sort of protect the economy and ensure that people would still pay their bills and so on. And in real estate, the cutting of the stamp duty tax to try to encourage people to keep the real estate sort of businesses and industry alive and buying houses and so on. So there's been a number of sort of approaches taken by the government, some big, some small, with regards to how they're addressing this from an economic perspective. I think the main thing that I've always been thinking throughout this whole time is obviously these measures are very necessary because they're going to dampen and limit the potential economic shock of what could be either a 3-month issue or God forbid not a 2-year issue with COVID, and how this is going to play out with regards to a vaccine and an eventual endpoint. But it's the idea of debt. The government is going to have to spend a lot of money, or if it continues to do what it's doing, it's going to spend even more money than it has currently. And based on kind of historical approaches taken after 2008, it's very likely that even further waves of austerity could be here in the future with regards to how that's going to impact the UK economy, at least. But of course, let's not forget that the UK is not isolated and alone in terms of being affected by coronavirus, and the fact that America is taking some form of approach over there, and other countries will be taking approaches in Europe and in Asia and so on, mean that the whole global supply chain is going to be really affected by how individual companies make their decisions. And we've seen a wide range of approaches, from herd immunity right through to very stringent lockdown, through to others which are much more sort of laissez-faire. So from an economic perspective, I think it's really interesting, but I just think that the short-term storyline we're going to have to draw from this is going to be debt, but necessary debt, in order to try to keep afloat the fundamentals of an economy, ensure that we don't have ramping levels of unemployment if we don't already, and it could have been potentially a lot worse without those sort of relief efforts.
Fair enough.
So as you talked about the hospitality industry, the COVID-19 has also affected all industries. So I would like to ask about what has the changes been impacted on the aviation industries, and how can they help themselves?
Yeah, so the aviation industry is a really big one. I think the kind of first initial reaction people have is they see the fact planes are grounded, and they think very focused on the fact that the airline industries themselves are going to be struggling. Richard Branson was calling for help with regards to how he was going to furlough his workers and relief packages, and the immediate vicinity of those workers operating the airplanes and the airport staff and so on are obviously the kind of first port of call. But the airline industry is so huge and so complex, and the fact that it's going to affect a number of other stakeholders as well. So it's not just the people getting on the planes, getting off the planes, and that's it. It's everything else in between. It's the hotel industry of where they're landing. Obviously, countries which have a huge GDP of their, a huge percentage of their GDP based on tourism are going to be massively affected by this. It's all the transportation systems that were in place to take people to and from all these different countries, insurance as well. So something that might seem as sort of single-faceted as an airline problem with planes not being in the sky on a surface level sort of analysis is actually really, really convoluted, and goes to show that an economy is inherently dependent on other industries coming together to provide a kind of package solution for a customer, rather than just one thing in isolation. So in terms of what the problem is for the airline industry, I think it's not just them; it's also everything else connected with it. In terms of how we fix this, like, I'm not a policy creator. I'm very limited in my area, knowledge in this area, but it's almost a question of time. And like anything that's related to COVID-19, the kind of movement towards a vaccine. I think, especially if countries are going to start increasing their quarantine levels and no-fly areas, and begin to shut down these sort of so-called air borders, or sort of the air bridges that they've created once the lockdown had began to lift. If we are approaching a second wave and we're approaching that other section of lockdown, then everything's going to be put on pause again. And the fact that airlines have already begun to sell off old stock or to kind of retire old airplanes is an indication that, at least for the short term, they're going to eventually be put on pause, like many other businesses, as a result of everything that's going on. So how you fix that, I don't know, because I don't think anyone has clearly got an idea quite how we tackle this whole problem at the moment, other than trying to resolve things from a health perspective and trying to balance that with the obviously the detriments that come with lockdown, people being locked in their houses, and the economic impacts of it as well. It's all one big balancing game, and I certainly don't have the answers, and I'd be surprised if anyone out there has a kind of perfect equation for it either.
True. Right. True. So let's talk about, we've talked about the industries, we've talked about the companies suffering. Let's just talk about the employees also. There have been major layoffs made by a lot of MNCs. They've laid off their employees. So they've suffered. And then the government here says that, listen, you can't do that. You can't just lay off your employees. So the company and the employees themselves aren't earning as much as they normally would. So they don't have an option here. They have to lay some people off to maintain themselves in a normal and a okayish spot. So how do you think the companies should deal with a situation like that? And how do you think that the government can help the companies come out of a situation like that, where they can come
Yeah,
to
so
amicable solution for the employees as well as the employers?
yeah, so the obviously everyone's working from home, and I think the messages of governments trying to get people back into offices is going to be difficult, because a lot of employees will either be, too worried about going back into work and the kind of potential health risks that involved with going back via public transport and everything else, and also the fact that a lot of people may have adapted to home working, given the fact we've been doing it for 6 or something months now, which is just crazy. Obviously, like I mentioned earlier, the furlough scheme was there to help try to lessen the economic shock and to try to make sure that companies weren't, as you say, just laying off employees left, right, and centre. I think with the sort of the approach that currently companies are currently taking is understandable, given the fact that if a scheme is put in place for them to take advantage of with regards to furloughing and protecting their own bottom line, they're going to do it. I think what's been really sad to see, or at least in the kind of initial surveys that have happened, I think there needs to be more extensive research on this, is the number of furloughed workers who still continued to work, which is illegal and you're not supposed to do that, during this time of kind of being furloughed and sat at home. And people who are supposed to be furloughed, working from home and receiving some sort of subsidized wage in order to pay their bills, are instead still working from home or still doing some form of work. I think the preliminary figures were something like 90% amongst men with regards to those who were furloughed and still working. I don't know the sample size, and I think that's also a really huge problem in terms of how employees are potentially being exploited by this. So from the government's perspective, with anything, they've got to review what they're doing and make sure that there's no fraudulent use of this, in the same way that there were some fraudulent uses of the sort of furlough system, and people who were self-employed, and others who had claimed obscene amounts from the government with everything that's going on. But in terms of how we go forward, again, I think the critical question is always going to come down to the idea of a vaccine and the idea of limiting the number of daily cases and deaths, because that is a big indicator of how the government's currently reacted. And given the fact that the health secretary, at least in the UK, recently stated that we are sort of at the limited point, and that we can't really go much further, and we need to begin to pump the brake pads, I think was his expression, is clearly an indication that the government's either might have to do another round of this subsidy, or at least try and find some other form of solution to this problem.
So, sir, lastly, I would like to ask that what are certain changes that you have seen in the legal ambit due to this COVID-19 outbreak?
Yeah, of course. So, like I said earlier, I think remote working and kind of how lawyers are delivering their services has changed, at least in the short term. I think what's quite surprised me is how how, given the fact that everyone has been made to work from home in this pandemic, or at least in the short term, with some restrictions being lifted now, every level of seniority has had to follow through with that. And so everyone from support staff, graduates, and kind of more junior levels, right through to senior partners and decision makers, have experienced at least some degree of remote work. Ideally, not its ideal format and counterpart, but at least some degree of it. And I think what surprised me the most is how across the board, both from junior level right through to more senior and more sort of partners and so on, people who have obviously worked within the industry in a given way and entered the profession in very different circumstances compared to where junior sort of level lawyers, millennials and Gen Z students are now, is the fact that they will have experienced it. And this may follow through with some regard to a greater appetite, at least, to see this as an option for flexibility and an option for lawyers to incorporate this into their working style and schedule if they want to, and at least the option being there for it to be an option in future. I can't see this being the case that firms which are large enough and significant enough to have huge offices in London are going to completely ditch this and go fully virtual, or at least downsize massively. Some more local regional firms have begun to shut their offices or have decided to go fully virtual. But the only caveat or comment I'd make on that is to ensure that remote working, again, doesn't affect everyone equally. And for people who have the resources, a dedicated office space, all of the necessary equipment, the fact that they don't have kids running around, don't have to juggle, being a parent with their working style, and they can kind of afford to, both from a money and time sort of an effort perspective, kind of set aside working time, their own space to do stuff, is obviously going to be a very different experience of how they will have I don't want to say enjoyed or currently, I guess, utilized the working time in this pandemic versus someone who is, sharing a flat with 4 other people because they're on the kind of bottom of the property ladder and looking to enter the profession, and this is their kind of first role. So in terms of how this is going to affect everyone, I think that's the only important statement I'd make, is to make sure that rather than trying to make a blanket decision which will ensure that we fully go virtual or we mandate that this will happen. Instead, I think I'd personally like to see it more be an idea of flexibility and giving people the option to choose what they do based on what they're comfortable with. Because like I said, there are people who have come out of this pandemic saying, I hate remote working. I can't do this balancing my own personal life and mix it in with what I'm doing at work. I'm potentially working more hours because I'm not being able to give myself time to separate from, this is when I'm at home doing my own thing versus now this is when I'm at home doing my work thing. And so I think if there's anything I'd like to see to come out of this pandemic, it would be a flexibility, or at least the option of remote working. And again, a more of an appetite towards alternative delivery methods of legal services, and how, things like virtual courtrooms, whilst they've had a few minor hiccups and kind of errors in the current situation with people. I think I've heard jurors getting up midway through a Zoom call and walking off the screen, and obviously that's a huge problem because you don't know what they're doing or if they're on their phone or something like that. And the kind of quirks of how this would work on a long-term basis are clearly still need to be ironed out, but at least the principles of trying to find a new way to allow employees to work remotely, and for the legal industry more generally to conduct their legal business, has kind of been experimented with. And I just hope that going forward, if we do return to something close to a resemblance of what we were before, we can at least look at these 1 or 2 years or however long we're in this current situation for, and try to analyze it and learn some lessons from it, and take the best bits of the flexibility and the option to work remotely, and to minimize the downsides of having to juggle those other commitments, or at least give people the option to go into the office for social occasions and being able to socially connect with their colleagues as well. I think based on surveys that have been done previously with remote working, this may have been even before the pandemic, if everyone is working remotely, it doesn't really seem to have too big an impact with regards to who's being favored for promotions or who is being considered to working harder and everything. But the critical factor is if those who are making decisions and more senior staff and those who are responsible for promoting others are in the office environment and they're not working virtually, and they have a mix of employees underneath them who do, there's an unfortunate perception, I think, just by very nature of being able to see someone in the office and see them quote unquote working, rather than giving them a task and not seeing them on their camera for 4 hours and then coming back, that you kind of build more of a connection with them, and there's a reported anyway increase in their sort of favorability for things like promotions and so on. So in terms of what that ideal solution looks like for once we're through all this, and how we're going to get that perfect mix, if there is one, between remote working, office working, I don't know. But at least, like I said, I at least hope that the industry generally and the clients who also engage with us will be able to take a look at the current situation, report what they do and don't like, and we can hopefully analyze and take those best bits with us if and when this is all over as well.
Yes. So thank you so much for such an amazing session. It was an insightful session and we learned a lot from you. Thank you so much for your presence and giving some amazing knowledge about the situation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time and your consideration. You're part of this program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we have more episodes coming soon with varied themes and people. So be sure to subscribe to the Law Culture and see you in the next episode. Thank you.